Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Ken Myers from GSA. Ken, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited to chat with you on all things, ICAM and Zero Trust. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a bit about your background, how you got to where you are now at GSA and what you're up to?
Yeah, definitely. Hey, good morning, everyone. Ken Myers. I'm a Virginia native. I actually have a passion for digital identity. After high school, I joined the Marine Corps, spent almost a decade in the Marine Corps. And I feel like that's where I got my introduction to identity because I was doing physical security. And then I was a network administrator and kind of a IT policy person before I actually jumped headfirst into digital identity. That brought me to where I am today with the General Services Administration. I'm actually the director of our Identity Assurance and Trusted Access Division within the Office of Government-Wide Policy. And we do four things within our office. We have a federal identity credential and access management initiative. That's actually a government-wide effort in establishing mature best practices around identity credential and access management. Second thing we do is related to public key infrastructure. That's a federal public key. So for those who are familiar with the federal government and our personal identity verification card, or their DoD colleagues with their common access card, the public key infrastructure that supports that is managed. The policy for that is managed by our office. We also have a testing program based on a NIST publication called FIPS 201. So we test physical access control systems and also smart cards for interoperability. So in my personal life, I'm also a doctoral candidate at Marymount University here in Arlington, Virginia, and that's in the cybersecurity program. So my research area is actually digital identity workforce planning. Like I mentioned, digital identity is kind of a passion, and I always wondered, being working professionally, having to hire people, never being able to find a digital identity person. So that's like one of the questions that pops in my head is like, why am I not able to find digital identity people? And so that's kind of the focus of my research. So I hope to talk a little bit about today also and get your feeling for where a cybersecurity workforce is today also.
Yeah, I would love to dive into the workforce aspect, and I'm sure Nikki has some research questions she would love to hit you with. So those will be coming. But I wanted to ask, to kick it off a little bit. Like I know I'm familiar with the federal, ICAM working group and some of the information and stuff that they put out around their strategy. It's very cloud, I won't say cloud centric, but cloud plays a major role. I want to ask, like initially, what are some of the fundamental differences between, IAM on-prem and IAM in the cloud that organizations should keep in mind?
Yeah, I'll do my best to. I don't know how technical your audience is, so I'll try not to throw out a bunch of acronyms. But actually, the Federal Chief Information Security Officers, the CISO Council, they have an ICAM subcommittee, and they actually held a working group that talked about cloud identity best practices. They looked at challenges, kind of misnomers, myth busters related to using ICAM in the cloud. And actually, one of the more interesting mythbusters that came out, and probably you can kind of relate to this, is there's like a mentality of cloud or nothing, right? We're either all in or we're not, right? And really, the reality is probably most organizations today, not even specific to the federal government, most organizations are probably in some type of hybrid cloud, whether they're operating their identity infrastructure like on premise, and they're kind of federating or single sign-on to their cloud applications, Office 365, Google Workforce, whatever those applications are. Or it's kind of a little bit the opposite. Maybe they're operating in cloud identity as a service and single sign-on and federating it that way also. So that was one big myth buster. And actually the working group published a playbook that's available on our website. That's playbooks.idmanagement.gov. These playbooks are actually vendor agnostic and technology agnostic as much as possible. They're a little federalized, I'll say, but not to the extent that maybe like the private sector or industry can't use them and understand what some of those best practices are. So it's not specific to, this is how you set up Azure, this is how you set up AWS or Google or IBM or any of those other vendors. We try our best to be technology agnostic there. So some of the fundamental changes there is that, so one great advantage in using kind of cloud IAM, identity as a services, is they seem to integrate multiple capabilities into one package. And that's usually a cloud-based directory, multi-factor authentication and kind of single sign-on. Comparing that to kind of on-premise tools, a lot of organizations are Microsoft based. And I'll just say, I'm not advocating for any vendors. If I mention name, I'm just trying to put it a little bit in context here. But when we look at it like an on-premise architecture, a lot of organizations are Microsoft based. So they have Active Directory, right? It's kind of a requirement for your domain. But then if you need single sign-on or multi-factor authentication, you'll use something like Active Directory Federation services, right? So it's two different components, maybe two different virtual machines. Now you have to manage those. So an advantage of using a cloud service, specifically within the federal government, like a FedRAMP cloud identity as a service, is you get those three capabilities into one. And this also actually helps out in centralizing some of those aspects, also managing it all within the same platform. If you look at the federal zero trust strategy, it talks about centralizing identity management. So using a single sign-on tool is one of those aspects of centralizing identity management. I mean, have you noticed from like a cloud perspective? I know you I follow you on LinkedIn, so I saw you did a bunch of AWS certifications, but have you noticed like a similar pattern for versus on-prem versus cloud also?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of things you're touching on, like those package managed services, make things a lot easier for organizations so that they're not trying to manage bespoke solutions from numerous vendors or even the same vendor. So they often package it as a managed solution. And I like how you talked about, the dichotomy of like hybrid cloud, because like we, as an industry, we approach everything as like certifications versus degree or experience versus, qualifications, or like everything is like this argument of like binary, this or that, as if like you can't have both. And the cloud is the same situation. We're likely going to have, and I think that's why you saw the evolution of, cloud first to cloud smart, is we realize, okay, well, maybe everything won't reside in the cloud. Like we are going to use on-prem and cloud. It will be like that for the foreseeable future, So I love that distinction. One thing I also wanted to ask you about too is like, looking at the playbooks and some of the information out there, there's a big emphasis, at least I thought so, on like identity as a service. And for one, maybe you can tell us about what that is for folks that don't know what ID as a service is. And then also, are there any considerations to keep in mind? Like, for example, we've seen some of the big vendors, have some security incidents, for example, recently. Is that a cause for concern, or is, how do organizations approach that while, also like kind of considering the risk of using a service like that?
Yeah, well, so identity as a service, I would say, we recognize this as more of like an industry term, right? Peace as a service, identity as a service, platform as a service, but the three core functions that we recognize for identity as a service is that you have basically, or basic level, you have a directory, multi-factor authentication, and an ability to federate, which is a single sign-on. So there's the kind of three basic capabilities. Now with different vendors, they may add on additional capabilities to that, such as like continuous authentication, being kind of in the cycle, looking at changes within that telemetry to maybe revoke access. Conditional access, I think that's along the same lines, although with conditional access, you're kind of looking for additional attributes. For example, maybe where someone or something, right? Because we got to remember, we got people and things trying to access our stuff, where something is trying to log in from, what type of device they're on. So one thing I noticed, like previously to come into GSA, I worked in the private sector, and I worked on a tool called a Cloud Access Security Broker. And I thought it was really interesting with a specific tool that was able to integrate some of the like HTTP accessibility things, like how web services are delivered, right? Taking in what language maybe your device is on, where you're coming from, what type of browser you're using, whether that's like a mobile form factor or a desktop form factor. And now you see a lot of security companies taking those kind of accessibility things and now making them kind of a access-based decisions on that. For example, if you're not running the latest operating system, right, kind of not allowing you access, not being on a specific OS, like I only want Windows devices to access my application. That's another one. So yeah, to answer your question for identity as a service, like the three basic capabilities that should be in there is a directory, should support multi-factor authentication, and hopefully multiple forms of phishing resistant multi-factor authentication, and then also ability to do single sign-on.
Yeah, you actually got right to what my follow-on question was going to be before I kicked it over to Nikki. Is like we've talked about MFA quite a bit, multi-factor authentication, and you used the term I was going to ask you about, which was phishing resistant, because like that was a big emphasis, if I'm not mistaken, within the federal zero trust strategy that came out around implementing MFA. So for those not familiar, what is phishing resistant MFA, and why should we be using it over other forms of MFA, for example?
Yeah. So actually, I did a little. I wrote a research paper that I'm trying to get published with another colleague of mine, and we looked specifically at this. And so the context of this research paper was actually looking at MITRE attack versus kind of academic papers. So to see if there's a gap between what's in academic writing versus what's in MITRE attack. And so just defining what phishing resistance is, we'll look at username and passwords, right? It's kind of a static credential. I'll go to a website, put it in, and it doesn't change. So if we look at like a phishing attack, right? I send you an email, says click on this link. You click on the link. It's like an authentic looking website. You put in a username and password. Me being the adversary hosting that website, I can then take that username and password you put in, turn around. And so what we're trying to do is break that cycle, right? Break that cycle where whatever credential you're putting in can then not be replayed, right? We're trying to stop that phishing part. And so I've seen, you've probably seen also some recent articles today about like one-time pins being phishable. Also, there's actually a new MITRE attack category called MFA fatigue. So that's something that you're seeing a little bit more, and that's where you're using a push notification, right? And boom, 1 a.m., boom, 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 over and over again, you're getting those push notifications to log in. It being 1 a.m., super tired, you're just like, okay, I accept. So that's another one. So what phishing resistance does is that it kind of breaks that cycle, and that there's kind of an out of band means to do that. So traditionally, within the federal government and also large organizations, like public key infrastructure certificates was one way to do that, right? I have the private key, the public key is maybe stored with that, and so you would need my private key to be able to access it, right? And only I can have it, can't be exported, and so that's a way to break the cycle. There's actually an organization called, and it's actually mentioned in the federal zero trust strategy. It's an industry group called Fast Identity Online, or FIDO, the FIDO Alliance. And they publish their own industry standards. I think a lot of major technology vendors support it, but they leverage the same technology behind public key infrastructure, just without the I, right? Just public key cryptography, same mentality of private public key pairs, but it's breaking that cycle. It's a little bit more user friendly. You don't have to operate the I part of it, and at least outside the federal government, it's a very well supported standard and specification, being like natively supported on devices. And I think that's like the important part there, is that from a user experience, right? And often in security, we don't factor in the user experience. Like, how easy is it for someone to use, right? There's that inverse graph. The more security you have, the less usable it is, right? And actually, I think I took a class at UMUC about security usability. Really interesting. Like, one aspect of it was like, what's the optimal height for an iris scanner, right? Right, because you got tall people, you got short people. What's the average height in there? And so that's really one of the best ways to kind of support phishing resistant is look at what's natively supported. Have you noticed kind of the same thing? I don't know how well versed you are with the FIDO spec.
Yeah, I actually have seen a lot of interest picking up in that, and in the phishing resistant, tokens and things like that. Not to name vendors, but YubiKey, obviously being one of the large players in that space, is getting a lot of attention as the government looks to move towards zero trust and in more rigorous MFA forms. I actually wanted Nikki to touch on something with you around secrets and also the human aspect that you brought up. I think she'd have a good perspective.
Yeah, 100% the reason why I've been really heavily invested in human factors in the last, 2 to 3 years of research, because exactly what you're saying around could be biometrics devices, could be our actual tools and applications that we use, and thinking about the users and how they use them. This idea of MFA fatigue and I think is one of those areas that's still not explored enough. And we definitely need more research around that, I think, and more visibility to it. So I'm really glad you brought it up. Yeah, we actually had a really great question in the chat about secrets, sort of secrets management. How does that fit into what we're doing with ICAM workflows, and how do we integrate that into what we do as either as best practice or bringing awareness to it? How do you feel about sort of secrets management in this space?
Yeah, so secrets, secrets management, actually, we talk about this a little bit in our cloud identity playbook. We actually have a privileged identity playbook that we should be publishing towards the end of the month, where we specifically or try to talk a little bit more about how to integrate MPs within your identity infrastructure. Um, I'll just say agnostically, when I say MPE, non-person entity, right? That's like any non-person within your, whether you call it a security boundary, your touch boundary, your organization. But what we found, or at least typically how these ICAM playbooks work, is that we form a working group of various experts from around the government. Sometimes that includes industry colleagues as well. And they come and they talk about what challenges they see, what myths that they're trying to, or barriers, I guess, that they're trying to come over within their organizations. And then we publish a best practice guide that we call a playbook. And so one of the things mentioned within this working group is that it seems like these non-person entities, whether that's like a robotic process automation, APIs, right? API keys, that's another one, secrets, system accounts, if you're in a Microsoft domain, but they're created with inherent privilege, right? That they have a specific function that's above a general user to perform either an automated task, like out of sight, out of mind. You know it's working until it doesn't. It's kind of like our utilities, right? We don't care about electricity until it turns off. It's kind of that same way also. And so one of the graphics that's in that playbook, it actually shows like an iceberg, right? Above the water, we see all of our users, we're managing those. Below the water is it's a much longer piece, and shows all the different kind of non-person entities on there. And so definitely from that perspective, if we treat those MPs as privileged users and integrate them into how we manage our privileged users within our systems, that's definitely a best practice there.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, sorry. I was gonna ask too, in sort of this avenue, right, around secrets management, and sort of, because I think ICAM, identity and access management, I think these areas are a lot bigger than sometimes we think about, right? There are a number of different areas we have to think about, whether it's technology specific or like the NP you're speaking about, these sort of service accounts or system level accounts that we need to consider within our ICAM strategy. And I was curious, I'm actually going to skip ahead on my questions because I think it's very relevant here, but around the language that we use. And when we talk about secrets management and passwords and service accounts and system accounts, but I'm curious about how you feel about sort of the language we use around identity and access management. You know, we talk about it as secrets and passwords and things like that, but there was this interesting article I read recently, and I want to get the name right. Beyond Zero Trust, Trust is a Vulnerability. And that article sort of got me thinking about how we talk about identity and access management. You know, do we consider these aspects as vulnerabilities, or do we consider them security controls? You know, how do we talk about them? And so I was just curious. Sorry, I skipped ahead on my question, but I was really curious about what you felt about that.
Yeah, no worries. Actually, this is a very big kind of, I feel within my space, is a very big contentious area of what words we use and how we use them. If you look at our FICAM playbooks, at the very top, we kind of have a glossary of terms. We try our best to stick to NIST terms, although they may not be as like plain language friendly. Like, for example, for when we're talking about phishing resistant authenticators, like one of the big questions is like, how do we bind it? And someone raised their hand and was like, well, I don't want to sound dumb, but what does bind mean? And you know, if as a security risk management person, maybe that word like means something to you, but you're like, oh, I mean register, right? And so the words we use in our space are very specific, especially from a risk management perspective, you're talking about like the risk management framework 853 security controls. How you explain something and what words you use are very important. So I know, Chris, if you, I don't know if you have any good stories around that.
Yeah, no, I think you guys are getting on the right thing, the right path with that topic, and it's almost like a philosophical debate, almost, you know, in terms of like, you know, the language that we use and how it makes people feel. You know, almost like trust is a bad thing, right? And that's not really a good message per se in a workforce where people want to work together and collaborate. So it is an important thing, but it's outside of my area of expertise. So I look to the experts on how to best approach that. One thing I wanted to ask you too is we've mentioned this ICAM working group quite a bit. I know you've been involved with it, and I've like shared a lot of the materials coming out of that group because they're really great materials and learning resources and such. I wanted to see, can you tell us a bit about that group, maybe how it came about, what your role is in it, and also, you know, how do you guys approach something like ICAM in an environment as big as the federal government, where you have such a diverse ecosystem of agencies, tools, vendors, you know, contract staff? Like, you know, how do you tackle something like that in such a large, diverse ecosystem?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, for Nikki's question, I just want to close with like when I'm trying to explain kind of zero trust, I explain it from a perspective of where do you user, or more from like the data is in one location, your users in another. What is the path to get there? And traditionally, that path, even within FICAM has a tagline of the right person at the right time. Is able to access the right data, right? And traditionally, and I feel like it's the same within Zero Trust, that there's a lot of caveats to that, right? The right person logging in from the right device, which is in the right location at the right time, maybe. And so when I try to explain Zero Trust, I say traditionally, right, you have to be on maybe an organizational device, maybe you have to be on a VPN, maybe you have to log in through a specific website. And so if we start removing some of those, if we remove the VPN, right, what changes then? I think the article you mentioned, it talks about Beyond Trust, how their use of reverse proxies. And that's really interesting, but it's still may not even completely factor in, like, where are you trying to flow the traffic to, right? That's the point of a VPN, reverse proxy, your network controls, you're trying to steer the traffic somewhere. And so usually when like a zero trust conversation comes up, I try not to get in, oh, that's not zero trust. Oh, that is zero trust. It's like, so what are we actually trying to accomplish? Or what are we removing, and what do we have to change to be able to accomplish that? So I don't know if you've noticed the same thing.
I was going to ask a quick follow-up question after we had come in from the audience, because you've talked a lot about VPNs, and I've had some interesting perspectives from people in my network, like Chase Cunningham and Greg Toohill, who have pretty strong opinions about a VPN, for example. You know, the question is, do you believe traditional PAM and VPNs will become obsolete, or do you think that they'll be kind of a longstanding part of our industry?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it kind of depends. It depends on the use case. Like another example I give where, what kind of a VPN just lets you onto the network, right? And, you know, when we used to use shared drives, like that's kind of like the broad, right? It lets you in the door, right? I have a lock on my front door. Once you get inside, there's really no other locks, right? So you can think of a VPN like that. Yeah, you can like layer on like microsegmentation and segmented networks and stuff like that. But it really depends on, again, the data, right? Is your data on premise? Do you have requirements to maintain it? Are you just more comfortable maintaining there? So then maybe there's still a requirement for a VPN. Or like, are you more cloud first, right? Are you moving everything to the cloud? And so the need to maintain a domain, a network is no longer there. And then it's all about maybe device control, creating tunnels, either reverse proxy, if you don't want to use an agent, or steering with agents on a device to get to that data. I think it was about, I think it was like 4 years ago, a previous company I worked at, I wrote an article, like a corporate blog post with someone, and it was called, "Are you cloud first or cloud averse?" And what was really interesting is it, depending on who you talk to, right? So if you think about an application like the front end versus the back end being the data, if we talk to front end-ish type people, very cloud first, right? Automated, we want to use all the best DevSecOps tools we can. But then when we talk to like the data backend people, they were like, whoa, hold on a little bit, not go crazy. I mean, have you noticed that kind of like bifurcation, if you will?
Yeah, definitely, especially in the security community. I mean, I think it's come around now to be more accepted that you can actually be more secure in the cloud, if
Yep.
done correctly, right? And you have the right workforce in place with the right skills, knowledge and abilities and things like that. But yeah, early on in my days of using cloud in the security community in particular, especially in the federal government, it was like, well, we can't touch it. We don't own it. Like, we can't control it. We can't trust it. But I think that's definitely changed. So I also want to ask you, it's often said, like we've talked about zero trust, use the analogy of the front door. You come in the front door, like, you can kind of roam around the entire house at that point. So I like how you're bringing it back to the example of, the perimeter is a lot different now. The way we approach, security within zero trust paradigm is a lot different. It's often said that, identity is a new perimeter in the age of zero trust. I want to ask, why people say that, why that is. And, what are the implications of that? And also, how do we tackle it? Because I've been in some organizations, I'm sure your role in the FICAM working group and stuff, I've seen some agencies where you have several IDPs, a lot of identity sprawl. How do we handle that? If that is a new perimeter, how do we actually do it correctly then?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I mean, that part, what you had mentioned about, can I trust the cloud? From the cloud identity working group, that was one of the myths that they talked about, is like, I think on-premise is more secure than cloud, or cloud is more secure than on-premise. And it's really not one or the other, but there are some definite advantages to using the cloud versus on-premise. And like the one main thing that they pointed to was kind of a more of like collective security, if you will, because you have your own security operations center. Your cloud vendor they're using, they probably also have that, and just the collective of not having to patch and then test and then deploy kind of those patches to your on-premise stuff, it kind of more little more happens automatically when using cloud tools. So on that one, but yeah, identity is new perimeter. That's a great tagline. Being in the digital identity space, it's great, having a greater focus on identity. But I'll caveat that with, like, if we look back at how FICAM was first created, I think right now it's probably about 15 years ago. And some of the initial guidance, there was a federal enterprise architecture when enterprise architecture was hot, that published standards on how to create a segment architecture. And FICAM, that's how FICAM started, as an ICAM segment architecture. And actually, if you go look at it, it's about 2008, 2009. A lot of what's in that ICAM segment architecture is very close to what's in kind of our zero trust architecture today, where it talked about enforcement points and authorization points and identity verification, and not so much multi-factor authentication, but has some of the same elements in there. So yeah, I mean, identity's new perimeter, honestly, that's overall one of the definite challenges within IT systems, right? So people need to access information to perform those tasks. Like, it's become more apparent that having strong identity processes and controls is one of the critical factors in implementing like the other pillars of zero trust, right? And like, similar to my dissertation, during my literature review, I looked at kind of a wide variety of documentation. If we look at the Verizon breach incident report and we look at news articles, and it's like the 0-day was exploited that caused a privilege escalation, right? So I'm looking at that privilege escalation. I'm okay. That's my identity process. So why aren't there more people focused on the privilege aspect of it, the controlling the identity aspect of it, and then not other parts of it?
Yeah.
So actually,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, on your point of privilege escalation, it's one of those things that I've been looking into a lot, especially around vulnerability chaining, because typically the idea is you either want full system compromise, but you may do that through privilege escalation. That's typically that caveat that they need to get to privilege escalation before they can conduct whatever attack it may be. That avenue usually funnels through privilege escalation and then can move out into lots of different types of attacks. So I just wanted to make that point about how privilege escalation and zero trust identity and access management, sort of being the perimeter, but it's also an interesting attack path too. So it's interesting from the sort of the ethical hacking or understanding how people are getting in, but also from the network defense side to say, how are we actually going to protect against this? And that privilege escalation piece, I think, is really one of the linchpins in there in between a lot of attacks.
Yeah, I'm curious because I mean, from a privilege escalation standpoint, right? You can either look at it as a software thing, and I see it from an identity perspective. But I would think I would curious to see or hear what your where your opinion is on the like software side. When you hear privilege escalation, what do you think? Do you like tag that to a specific area of cyber, or what do you think?
Oh yeah. So privilege escalation, I usually think of, I have a very a background in Active Directory. So I always think like privilege escalation in directory services. But it could be from a taking advantage of a system account, which may be privileged, taking advantage of a service account, which may be privileged. So so it could be privilege escalation from a user account getting access to things that they shouldn't by escalating or elevating the role or getting access to additional privileged groups. Or could be from the aspect of actually compromising that privileged account by using a general account, because I've seen it in a few different ways. So I think it does span across different technologies. I guess I don't see it as, you know, necessarily just software or just hardware or just directory services, but can span across applications. Yeah. And then I had one more question before I throw it back to Chris. While we're talking about privileged accounts and privilege escalation, this idea that you need to, if there is no MFA strategy, if you're compromising the password, then you're able to conduct those attacks that much faster and that much easier. So there's sort of been this push in the industry for passwordless solutions, and I can't remember what the hashtag is, but it's something like stop the password or you know, stop using the password, which I thought was great. But you know, how realistic is that for companies and organizations and people to really adopt that strategy? You know, it's difficult to get away from solutions that use passwords to move to whether it's like a functional ID or something like that. So I'm just curious what you think about passwordless solutions.
Oh yeah, I mean it's complete. No, I'm joking. Yeah, you know, I mean I don't know about y'all, but I feel kind of weird sometimes when we look at kind of technology and vendor agnostic best practices, especially if I look at like older FICAM guidance. Like it was amazing guidance, right? Talking about attribute-based access control and some more advanced kind of identity stuff. But at least back then, it seemed like technology hadn't caught up yet. And it seems like today with passwordless, everything we do, every website we go to from like a public perspective, and an important aspect of digital identity is understanding the context of identity, right? Whether you're a workforce, like you're an employee, you're part of the public, you're accessing something maybe to buy. And then there's specific like law enforcement, national security use cases. And I say typically within the FICAM, it's a workforce focus, but it's easy to kind of merge public with workforce in there. And so from a passwordless perspective, looking at the technology that we use, it just seems like everywhere we go, we always have to set up a password, but you know, we can add kind of a passwordless option to it. And one of the challenges within, I would say, like identity trust frameworks is that it's hard to be like born, like stuff to be born passwordless. Like when I use application, I notice automatically I don't have to set a password. I think that's interesting, but it'll take like a group effort for everyone to start, like every application, every relying party to start supporting something like that. So yes, I mean it's possible, but the same challenges that we've had in the past, like I'm not even talking specific to the federal government, right? We as just consumers go into different websites, our siloed approach, that everywhere I go, I use a different password, which kind of created password managers, which evolved into now I can kind of go to different websites, use a Google login or an Amazon login to get there. But now there's privacy implications to that. You know what, moving on to the next step, you know, there's a lot of academic research and even some production environments using decentralized identities, which is bringing the control of the identity back to the user, but there's still some control aspects in there. And at least from an academic perspective, I've been thinking about and I think it's called identity owner within the W3C, verifiable credentials, but who actually owns that identity, right? Whether that's an organization, and how portable is it when you're moving to different organizations. So that's a little bit of a kind of a loftier philosophical answer. I don't know if I tried to do my best there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a deep one, and it can be technological or like ethical, you know, so it's really a complicated topic. And you touched on, like, you know, I think a good thing, which is we are moving towards maybe passwordless, but it's going to take some time for the industry to evolve, and like for all, you know, vendors and, you know, software support that uniformly. So we have a long way to go, I think, until we get there, although it does hold some promise.
Yeah. Well,
Oh, go
Well,
ahead.
I would, yeah, sorry. I would just say one thing. I mean, from like an enterprise identity best practice perspective, I think those in security can understand, looking at where the adversary is looking at, right? So they're not looking at where we have the high walls, where we have the most security, but they're looking at where we aren't. And usually like a password reset is where that is. So maybe we have that phishing resistant multi-factor authenticator as our primary, but what happens when we lose it? We lose our device, have to do something else. What is that? Password reset, right? Is that non-phishing resistant? Is it just a username password exception? And really, that's where really need to think, like, not necessarily focus on our primary, but what are our secondary when our primaries don't work, right?
Yeah, definitely good distinction. And then there was a comment in the chat here. It says, "Great presentation. How do we get access to this even after today?" It'll be on LinkedIn Live to watch, on my page, but it'll also be put up on our YouTube channel for Resilient Cyber, and also on all the various podcast outlets. So definitely check it out there too. I did have a follow-on question. My last question for you today, Ken. So we don't take up all your time today on this Friday, but we've talked a lot about the federal, ICAM group. We talked about the FICAM playbooks, zero trust strategy, things like that. For organizations or individuals looking to learn more about, ICAM and zero trust, any other resources you want to call out that they should go check out and dig into?
Yeah. So the federal government has their federal zero trust strategy. That's available at zero trust or zerotrust.cyber.gov. If for specific identity best practices, that's at playbooks.idmanagement.gov. I mean, that's the best way to find it. It's actually a GitHub repository. It's linked on our main website, so you can see, if you're familiar with how GitHub works, you can see some of the stuff that we're working on. I mentioned the privileged identity playbook. There's like small updates in there as well. There's actually also a way to contribute content. So again, not federal specific, but anyone who either sees kind of a content gap or maybe sees, oh, this looks a little outdated, you can always contribute content if you're familiar with GitHub works. We have a link on our website on how to do that. And I think you had mentioned also like how the FICAM working groups work. And it's mostly driven by either gaps or needs within the federal government. Agencies can participate sometimes, like through organizations like ATARC, ACT-IAC, but that's usually how one of the working groups work.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we did cover sort of the ton of topics between ICAM, zero trust. But I want to take us out with our last question that we ask everyone, and very interested in your perspective. What does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, so cyber resiliency to me just means through whatever you're trying to do. In a way, it kind of talks about like availability. Just making sure that whatever mission purpose that your IT is fulfilling is able to do it through kind of the ups and downs of whatever brings you that day, right? Because to me, IT is just a function of delivering a mission, whether that's mission is like selling products, delivering citizen services if you're a government. But cyber resiliency means that you have a backup plan when things may not go your way. I mean, how do you guys define it?
Yeah, that's pretty close, I think, to how we think about resiliency too. And I don't want to speak for Chris, but definitely this, how do you sort of understand ahead of time what can go wrong, and how do you sort of fix that as you go? Well, I wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us today and talking about all things zero trust, identity access management, secrets management, passwordless solutions, everything. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ken. And that'll take us out for the week. We will see everybody next week. Thank you.
Thank you.